Herr Baker saw a hungry little girl looking through the window and gave her a piece of bread. The bakery owner caught them and made an unexpected decision that changed everything. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon when Manuel, with his rough, calloused hands from years of work, lit the wood-fired oven that dominated the heart of his small bakery. The bakery, nestled in a corner of the picturesque town, had been the center of his life for decades. It was a place where the aromas of fermenting dough and freshly baked bread mingled with memories of days gone by, when his wife, the true master baker, was still alive. That morning, like every morning since she had passed, Manuel went through his routine in silence. He loved his craft, but he did it with a persistent sadness that no one else could see. Each loaf of bread he kneaded was an attempt to keep his wife's memory alive, as if with every turn of the dough he could feel her presence once more, even if only for an instant. Winter's chill was beginning to settle in the town, covering the cobblestone streets with a thin layer of frost. Manuel busied himself arranging the first batches of the day, carefully placing the golden, crispy loaves in the bakery's display. Outside, the wind whistled through the bare branches of the trees, sweeping away the last leaves of autumn. It was at that moment, as Manuel was arranging the bread in the display, that he noticed something that made him pause. On the other side of the glass, right in front of the display, stood a little girl. Her large, dark eyes, filled with hunger and longing, followed Manuel's every move with an almost painful fascination. The girl, with a pale face and disheveled hair, seemed to have been brought there by the same cold wind that blew through the town's streets. She wore worn-out clothes, far too light for the harsh winter that was setting in, and her rosy cheeks betrayed her exposure to the icy air. Manuel felt a pang in his chest, a mix of compassion and sadness that made him look down. He remembered the days when his wife insisted that bread was more than a business. It was a service to the community. "Bread nourishes the body, but kindness nourishes the soul," she used to say. And at that moment, seeing the little girl alone and hungry, those words echoed in his mind like a distant but clear call. Without thinking twice, Manuel left what he was doing and headed for the bakery door. He opened it carefully, letting the cozy warmth from inside slip out onto the street, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The girl, startled by the sound of the door, looked at him with eyes full of uncertainty and hope. Manuel, with a gentle and kind smile, crouched down to her level. "Here you go, little one," he said, offering her a piece of freshly baked bread. The bread was still warm, and its unmistakable aroma made the girl's eyes widen in surprise. The girl, who Manuel would later learn was named Valerie, accepted the bread with trembling hands. Her face, which had been marked by need, lit up with a shy smile, one that Manuel sensed she didn't show often. Carefully, Valerie held the bread as if it were a treasure, and after a brief glance into Manuel's eyes, she turned and ran down the street, her small feet echoing against the stones as she disappeared among the old houses and winding paths of the town. Manuel watched her until Valerie's tiny figure faded into the distance. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, and for a moment he felt a restlessness he couldn't quite understand. What circumstances could have led such a small child to wander the streets with such an expression of need? That question lingered with him as he returned to the bakery, closing the door behind him. However, what Manuel didn't know was that his act of kindness hadn't gone unnoticed. From the shadows of the shop, among the shelves of flour and trays of bread, Mr. Albert had witnessed the entire scene. The young bakery owner, who had arrived early that morning to check the inventory, watched closely as Manuel, his oldest employee, broke the strict business rules to help an unknown little girl. Mr. Albert, a man of 32 with a stern gaze and a reputation for being ruthless in business, stood still, processing what he had just seen. Though his face remained inscrutable, something inside him stirred. The image of the girl accepting the bread with a mix of gratitude and desperation remained etched in his mind. There was something in her eyes, something eerily familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. As Manuel continued his work, unaware of Mr. Albert's presence, the young owner decided to say nothing at that moment. But as he walked to his office at the back of the bakery, an idea began to form in his mind. A decision he didn't yet fully understand, but one he knew would change the course of everything he had known until then. The silence in the bakery's office was deep, broken only by the soft creak of the old wood under Mr. Albert's feet as he paced back and forth, lost in thought. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows that accentuated the hard lines of his face. Outwardly calm, Albert was fighting an internal battle that had kept him uneasy since the moment he saw the hungry girl at the bakery's door. From a young age, Mr. Albert had learned that success in business required discipline, coldness, and above all, a clear mind. His father, from whom he had inherited the bakery, had always instilled in him that the family business must be run with a firm hand without giving in to sentimentality. However, the image of the girl, Valerie, clutching the piece of bread, had cracked his cold facade, awakening memories and feelings he had long buried. It wasn't the first time he had seen need on the town's streets, but something about that girl had touched him deeply. Perhaps it was her eyes, dark and full of a mix of desperation and hope, that reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. Or maybe it was the way Manuel, his oldest and most trusted employee, had reacted without hesitation, breaking the rules to give a little relief to that child. Determined not to be swayed by impulses, Mr. Albert tried to focus on the numbers, the inventory, the bakery's accounts. But as the hours passed, his mind kept returning to the image of Valerie, to her thin figure and her expression of wonder upon receiving the bread. Finally, unable to concentrate on work, he realized he had to act. That afternoon, when the bakery's bustle had quieted down and the last customers had left, Mr. Albert put on his coat and headed out into the town's streets. The cold air hit his face, clearing some of the confusion that had accompanied him all day. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but something inside him guided him, an impulse he couldn't clearly define. He walked along the cobblestone streets, passing by old houses that had seen generations of families grow up and grow old. His mind was still occupied with the image of Valerie and the sense of responsibility that had begun to emerge in him, a new and unsettling feeling that made him question his own nature. After a few minutes of walking, his steps led him to the outskirts of town, where houses began to thin out and the landscape grew more desolate. It was there, on a side street almost forgotten by time, that Mr. Albert saw the ruined house he had noticed earlier that morning. The structure was on the verge of collapse, with broken windows and a door hanging from a rusty hinge. However, what caught his attention most was the small figure of Valerie sitting on the threshold, nibbling on the piece of bread Manuel had given her hours before. Mr. Albert stood still, silently observing as the girl ate carefully, as if wanting to make each bite last. On her face, though marked by the hardships of life, there was a faint smile, a trace of the satisfaction that only comes from fulfilling such a basic need as hunger. It was at that moment that he realized he couldn't ignore what he was seeing. He advanced toward the house, his steps crunching on the gravel of the path. Valerie looked up as she heard him approach, and their eyes met once more. This time, however, there was no fear in her gaze, only curiosity. Mr. Albert gave her a slight smile, but his attention quickly shifted to the inside of the house, where a larger, hunched figure appeared in the dim light. It was an older woman, her face marked by deep wrinkles that spoke of a life of hard work and pain. Her hands, which must have once been strong and agile, now trembled slightly as she leaned on a cane to approach the door. Mr. Albert recognized her immediately, though many years had passed since he last saw her. "Mrs. Elizabeth," he murmured, more to himself than to her. That woman had been a significant figure in his childhood, someone who had been present in the warmest memories he had of his mother. But now, seeing her in such a state, living in such precarious conditions, filled him with an unexpected sadness. Mrs. Elizabeth looked at him with clear eyes, which despite her age still shone with a mix of wisdom and pain. "Albert," she said softly, recognizing him immediately, "it's been a long time." The words hung in the air, suspended between them like a thread of shared memories. Mr. Albert didn't know what to say. He had come following an impulse, and now, standing before this woman who had once been so important in his life, he felt disarmed. "I came to see you," he finally said, though the truth was he didn't even know why he had come. "I wanted to know how you're doing." Elizabeth nodded slowly, as if understanding something Albert still couldn't grasp. "We're not well, Albert," she said, looking at Valerie, who was now clinging to her skirt. "But we manage. We always do." The frankness in her voice, the absence of resentment or complaint, made something in Mr. Albert's chest tighten. He couldn't continue being a spectator in his own life, not when so much was at stake. "There's something I can do for you, for both of you," he finally said, his voice firm but with a tone of humility he hadn't used in a long time. "I want you to work at the bakery. I have a place for you, and for Valerie." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. Her lips trembled a bit before she responded, "I don't know if I still have what it takes for that. It's been many years." Mr. Albert shook his head with a conviction that surprised even him. "I know you do. And more importantly, we need you. Manuel needs you. The bakery needs the recipe for dream bread." Silence fell between them as Elizabeth processed his words. Finally, with a mix of resignation and hope, Elizabeth agreed, but not without setting a condition. "If I do it, Manuel must be an essential part of making the bread. I want to pass on what I know to him." Mr. Albert nodded, knowing he was making a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who depended on the bakery. As he bid farewell to Mrs. Elizabeth and Valerie, he felt he had taken an important step towards something he couldn't name yet, but that he sensed was fundamental to his own destiny. That night, as he lay down to sleep, the image of Valerie and Mrs. Elizabeth at the door of that ruined house lingered in his mind. He knew this was only the beginning of something bigger, something that would change everything he had known until now. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, as if the path he was taking would lead him to a place that, though uncertain, promised to be a new beginning. The next morning dawned with a grey and cloudy sky, mirroring the heaviness in Mr. Albert's heart as he prepared for what he knew would be a crucial conversation. The memory of his meeting with Mrs. Elizabeth and Valerie was still fresh in his mind, fueling a determination he hadn't felt in years. This day would not be just another in the bakery's routine. What he was about to do could change the course of his life and the lives of those he had decided to help. Mr. Albert arrived at the bakery early, even before Manuel had lit the oven. The stillness of the place, usually bustling with morning work, gave him a moment to reflect on what he was about to do. He knew that what he was planning went against the way his father had run the business, but he also knew that circumstances had changed. Now it wasn't just about numbers and profits, it was about something deeper, something beyond mere business management. When Manuel arrived, he was surprised to see Mr. Albert already at the bakery. The young owner greeted him with a slight but determined smile, a gesture Manuel wasn't accustomed to seeing. However, he said nothing, waiting for Albert to reveal the reason for his early presence. "Manuel," Mr. Albert began, his voice soft but firm, "today I want to talk to you about something important. I need your support in a decision I've made." Manuel, always loyal and respectful, nodded, waiting silently. Mr. Albert continued, "Yesterday, I visited someone you know well, Mrs. Elizabeth. She's going through a tough time, and I've decided to offer her a position here at the bakery." Manuel's eyes widened in surprise. Mrs. Elizabeth was a legend in the town, known for her unique baking skills, but she had retired many years ago after a series of personal tragedies. The idea of her returning to the trade was something Manuel had never imagined, especially under Mr. Albert's leadership. "I know it's an unusual decision," Mr. Albert admitted, "but I believe it's the right thing to do. Elizabeth needs a chance to reclaim what she's lost, and we need her wisdom and experience. But she's set a condition. She wants you to work alongside her as her apprentice." Manuel remained silent for a moment, absorbing his boss's words. The idea of learning from Mrs. Elizabeth, of working side by side with someone he had always admired, was something he had never expected. But he also knew that accepting this would mean taking on great responsibility, not just for the quality of the bread, but for the legacy that Mrs. Elizabeth represented. "It will be an honor," he finally said, his voice filled with gratitude and a touch of nervousness. "I'll do my best to live up to it." Mr. Albert nodded, satisfied with Manuel's response. But he knew this conversation was just the first of many he would have that day. He needed to ensure that Elizabeth would accept the proposal and feel welcome in the bakery, and for that he would have to handle the situation delicately. Later that same day, Mr. Albert returned to the dilapidated house where he had found Mrs. Elizabeth and Valerie. The cold air felt more intense, as if winter had decided to show its true face. When he arrived, he found Elizabeth sitting by the broken window, gazing at the horizon with a lost expression. "Mrs. Elizabeth," he greeted her, with a respect reserved only for those who truly deserved it. Elizabeth turned to him, her gaze calm but inquisitive. She had spent the night reflecting on Mr. Albert's offer, on what it would mean to return to the bakery after so many years. Although the idea of working in her old trade again brought her a certain joy, it also filled her with fear. Would she be able to meet the expectations? Could she handle the weight of the past that would inevitably return to her mind? "Albert," she finally responded, with a voice stronger than she had felt in years. "I've thought about your proposal, and I accept. But as I said yesterday, I want Manuel to be my apprentice. There's much I need to teach him if this bakery is going to thrive as it should." Mr. Albert smiled, relieved that Elizabeth had accepted. He knew her presence in the bakery would be a significant change, but he was also convinced that it was a change for the better. However, Elizabeth wasn't finished speaking. "There's something else," she continued, looking at Valerie, who was playing in a corner with a piece of wood she had found. "I want Valerie to be with me at the bakery. I don't want to leave her alone here." Mr. Albert looked at her, understanding the depth of her request. For Elizabeth, Valerie was not just a child under her care. She was the only thing she had left in this world, her connection to the future and the reason she had kept going for so long. "Valerie is welcome," Mr. Albert replied gently. "She can be at the bakery as long as necessary. We'll take care of her as if she were one of the family." Elizabeth nodded, a mix of relief and gratitude filling her heart. She knew Mr. Albert was a man of his word, and his promise to take care of Valerie meant more than he could imagine. With the agreement sealed, Mr. Albert, Elizabeth, and Valerie returned to the bakery that same afternoon. The air inside the establishment seemed warmer than usual, filled with a renewed energy. Elizabeth, with Manuel's help, began to reacquaint herself with the surroundings, inspecting the oven, utensils, and ingredients with the precision and experience of someone who had spent a lifetime in the trade. Meanwhile, Valerie, with her curious eyes and youthful energy, explored every corner of the bakery, fascinated by everything she saw. Her presence, though small, filled the place with a joy that had been absent for a long time. As night fell, the first batch of bread under Mrs. Elizabeth's supervision was ready to come out of the oven. Manuel, under her watchful eye, had followed every step of the recipe with precision. When he pulled out the golden steaming bread, a delicious aroma filled the air, evoking memories of times past. Mr. Albert, who had been observing everything from a corner, felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. For the first time in many years, he felt that the bakery was not just a business, but a place full of life, of promises, and a legacy that he was determined to preserve. That night, as he closed the bakery, Mr. Albert lingered a moment longer, looking at the place that had been the center of his life for so long. He knew that the decisions he had made that day were just the beginning of a path that would not be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace, knowing he had done the right thing. The following morning, inside the bakery, the warmth of the oven and the smell of freshly baked bread offered a refuge against the cold outside. Since Mrs. Elizabeth had returned to work, the bakery seemed more alive than ever. Customers began frequenting the place again, drawn by the promise of the bread of dreams, a recipe many had remembered with nostalgia and others had only heard about in stories. Mr. Albert watched with satisfaction as the bakery began to thrive once more. However, in the back of his mind, a persistent unease kept him alert. He knew that his decision to bring Mrs. Elizabeth and Valerie to the bakery would not be well received by everyone, especially by someone who was about to return to the town. It was on a cold, grey morning when the sound of a luxury car breaking the village's tranquility reached the bakery. The tires crunched on the snow as a shiny black car stopped in front of the door. From inside the vehicle, a young, elegant man stepped out, his expression serious and calculated. He wore an expensive wool coat and perfectly polished shoes that seemed out of place on the cobbled, snow-covered streets. Mr. Albert, hearing the car stop, stepped out to the counter just as the bakery door opened and the young man entered. It was Mark, his younger brother, whose return had been expected, though not desired. Mark and Mr. Albert had taken very different paths in life. While Albert had decided to stay in the village and take over the family bakery, Mark had abandoned everything related to the family business to seek his fortune in the city. And he had found it. Mark was now a successful businessman with a modern mindset and ambitions that did not include preserving old traditions. "Albert," Mark greeted with a cold and distant smile, "it's been a long time." Mr. Albert looked at him with a mix of surprise and caution. He knew that Mark's return was not just a simple gesture of nostalgia. His brother always had a motive behind every action, and Albert sensed that this return would be no exception. "Mark," Albert responded, keeping his voice neutral. "Yes, it has been a long time. What brings you back?" Mark smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Business, of course. I've been following closely what you've been doing here with the bakery. It seems things have improved lately." Mr. Albert nodded, not letting his brother's words fool him. He knew that Mark wasn't here to praise his work. "The bakery has started to prosper again, yes, thanks in part to Mrs. Elizabeth's help." At the mention of Elizabeth's name, Mark's smile faded slightly, and his expression became more serious. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Albert. I've come with a proposal, one that I think could benefit both of us greatly." Mr. Albert felt a knot form in his stomach. "What kind of proposal?" Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice as if what he was about to say was confidential, although the bakery was empty at the moment. "I've been in contact with a consortium from the city that is interested in investing in this town. They want to build a shopping center where the bakery stands. They're willing to pay a considerable sum for the land, much more than you could earn from the business in the coming years." The impact of Mark's words hit Mr. Albert like a punch. Selling the bakery, the legacy of his family, to build a shopping center was an idea that went against everything he had stood for. But he knew Mark didn't see it that way. "Mark," Albert began, trying to keep his composure, "this bakery isn't just a business. It's our heritage, the legacy of our family. I can't just sell it, especially not for a shopping center." Mark sighed as if he had anticipated this response. "Albert, I know you have an emotional attachment to this place, but we need to be realistic. The world has changed. Small businesses like this are no longer sustainable in the long term. A shopping center would bring modernity and jobs to the town. Think about the future, not just the past." Mr. Albert felt a mix of anger and frustration. He knew that Mark couldn't understand what the bakery meant to him, to the community, and now to Valerie. "Mark, it's not just about nostalgia. This bakery is the heart of this town. It's not just about money." Mark frowned, clearly irritated by his brother's resistance. "You've always been sentimental, Albert, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. This is a good deal, and you should seriously consider it." Before Mr. Albert could respond, the back door of the bakery opened, and Mrs. Elizabeth appeared with a tray of freshly baked bread. Seeing Mark, she stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized the young man who had left the town years ago. "Mark," she said firmly, without a trace of the warmth that usually characterized her, "I didn't expect to see you here." Mark greeted her with a nod, but his tone wasn't any warmer. "Mrs. Elizabeth, I heard you're back at the bakery. I'm glad you found a place for yourself." Elizabeth didn't respond immediately, but her eyes met Albert's, searching for a sign. Mr. Albert nodded slightly, and she understood what that meant. She placed the tray of bread on the counter and approached Mark, maintaining her firm stance. "Mark, this bakery isn't just a place of work for me. It's a home, a place full of memories. I can't imagine seeing it turned into a shopping center, and I know your brother feels the same." Mark looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "Elizabeth, with all due respect, things have changed. We can't hold on to the past forever." Elizabeth, with the wisdom of the years, simply smiled. The past has more power than you think, Mark, and sometimes it's the only thing that holds us together when the future is uncertain. Mark was about to respond but stopped himself. He knew convincing Elizabeth wouldn't be easy, and his patience was starting to wear thin. However, he wasn't someone who gave up easily. "Think it over, Albert," he finally said, turning his attention back to his brother. "This is a unique deal, and it won't last forever. But if you decide to stay stuck in this relic of the past, it will be on you." Without waiting for a response, Mark turned and left the bakery, his steps determined, and his attitude filled with the arrogance of someone used to getting what they want. Mr. Albert watched him leave, feeling an even greater weight on his shoulders. Elizabeth, who had remained silent, approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It won't be easy, Albert, but if you really want to save this place, you'll have to fight for it." Mr. Albert nodded, knowing that Elizabeth's words were true. Mark's return had brought with it a conflict he couldn't avoid, and he knew the future of the bakery and of Valerie depended on the decisions he would make in the coming days. As he prepared to close the bakery for the night, Mr. Albert realized that he was no longer alone in this fight. He had Elizabeth, Manuel, and Valerie, and with them by his side, he was ready to face any challenge, even if it meant going against his own brother. The icy night wind slipped under the door as he closed it, but this time, instead of feeling cold, Mr. Albert felt the warmth of determination. He knew that what was at stake was much more than a business. It was his family's legacy, Valerie's life, and the very essence of the community. And he wasn't going to let it be taken away without a fight. The next day, tension filled the bakery. Although the day began like any other, with the smell of fresh bread filling the air and the first customers coming in to pick up their daily loaves, something in the atmosphere felt different. Mr. Albert, absorbed in his thoughts, barely noticed the bustle around him. The conversation with his brother Mark still echoed in his mind, filling his heart with unease. He knew that things wouldn't be easy from now on, but what worried him most was the impact all this would have on the people who depended on him, especially Valerie. Valerie, for her part, had found in the bakery a place where she felt safe. Though her life had been difficult, here she had discovered something new, the warmth of a community, the affection of Mrs. Elizabeth, and the peace of being in a place where she was valued. Despite her young age, Valerie sensed that something wasn't right. The worried looks of Mr. Albert and Mrs. Elizabeth didn't go unnoticed by her, although she didn't fully understand what was happening. That afternoon, when the morning bustle had subsided and the sun began to decline on the horizon, Mrs. Elizabeth called Mr. Albert to a secluded corner of the bakery. There was something in her gaze that indicated what she had to say was important, something she had kept in her heart for a long time, and that now, finally, she was ready to reveal. "Albert," Elizabeth began, her voice low and filled with emotion, "there's something you need to know. It's a secret I've carried with me for many years, but I can't keep it hidden any longer." Mr. Albert, puzzled by the seriousness in Elizabeth's tone, nodded slowly, giving her the signal to continue. Elizabeth took a deep breath before speaking again. "Valerie is not just any child who came into my life by chance," Elizabeth confessed, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "She's your daughter, the daughter of the woman you once loved." The words hit Mr. Albert like a sledgehammer. For a moment he felt the ground beneath his feet give way, his mind filled with memories he thought he had buried long ago, a youthful love, a relationship that had ended abruptly due to the pressure from her family, a pain he had never fully overcome. How is that possible?" Albert murmured, unable to process the revelation. Elizabeth looked at him with eyes full of understanding. She knew that what she was saying was difficult to accept, but she also knew that Albert had the right to know the truth. Her mother, the woman you loved, was the great love of your life, Albert. But her family didn't accept the relationship due to the social differences between you. She was forced to leave you, and when she lost you, she was left alone and helpless, expecting a child. That's when I found her." Mr. Albert felt a lump in his throat as Elizabeth continued her story. She didn't have the courage to return to the town, knowing that her family had disowned her and that you had moved on with your life. When Valerie was born, her mother was weak, exhausted by the circumstances, and shortly after she passed away. She asked me to take care of her daughter, to protect her from the world that had been so cruel to her. Elizabeth paused, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I've raised Valerie as if she were my own granddaughter, but I always knew that at some point I would have to tell you the truth. And that moment has come. That night, after closing the bakery, Mr. Albert made his way to the small room where Valerie slept, nestled in the warmth of the oven that still emanated a faint heat. He watched her for a long time, feeling a connection with her that he hadn't understood until that moment. He knew he had to find a way to tell her the truth, to help her understand who she really was. But for now, all he could do was be there for her, just as Elizabeth had told him. And in that moment, as he watched her sleep, he swore that he would do everything possible to protect her, to give her the life her mother had dreamed of for her. Winter continued its course, wrapping the town in a blanket of cold that felt more intense with each passing day. However, inside the bakery, the warmth and coziness remained a refuge for those seeking a bit of comfort during the harshest season of the year. Things had changed since Mrs. Elizabeth's revelation to Mr. Albert. Although Valerie still didn't know the truth, Albert made an effort to be more present in her life, protecting her with renewed care, while he tried to process the weight of the information he now carried. However, the peace of the bakery was about to be disturbed by an external figure. Madison, a young journalist who had come to town to write an article about small businesses that had survived the economic crisis, became increasingly interested in the story behind Mr. Albert's bakery. What had started as a simple investigation for her report had turned into a personal obsession. Rumors of a secret recipe, the story of Mrs. Elizabeth and the family conflicts surrounding the bakery, all pointed to something much deeper than met the eye. Madison was known for her tenacity and ability to uncover hidden stories. From the moment she entered the bakery, she sensed there was a deeper story waiting to be told. She decided to stay longer in the town, thoroughly investigating the past of the family that had founded the bakery and the reasons behind the recent resurgence of the business. Every time she spoke with the townspeople, she gathered fragments of information that only fueled her curiosity. One afternoon, as Mr. Albert and Manuel were working in the oven, Madison entered the bakery, notebook in hand, and a friendly smile on her face. She had spent the last few days talking to the town's elders, who nostalgically remembered the days when Mrs. Elizabeth was the most famous baker in the region. What she had discovered led her to suspect that the relationship between Elizabeth and Mr. Albert's family was deeper than anyone could imagine. "Good afternoon, Mr. Albert," Madison greeted as she approached the counter. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Mr. Albert, though busy, looked up and gave her a polite smile. He had learned to be wary of journalists, but Madison had shown a genuine interest in the bakery's story, which had made him lower his guard a bit. "Of course, Madison. How can I help you?" Madison leaned over the counter, her expression a mix of curiosity and seriousness. "I've been researching the bakery, and I've discovered that Mrs. Elizabeth has a fascinating history here. I'd like to know more about her return and the secret recipe that, according to rumors, has revived the business." The mention of the secret recipe made Mr. Albert feel a pang of discomfort. He knew that recipe was more than just a simple formula for making bread. It was a symbol of his family's legacy, and now, with Elizabeth's revelation, also a link to Valerie. "Mrs. Elizabeth's recipe is something very personal to her," he replied cautiously. "It's a family legacy that we've decided to preserve." Madison noticed the reluctance in Mr. Albert's voice, but she wasn't willing to give up so easily. "I understand, and I respect that some things are private, but I think people would be interested in knowing more about how tradition and family history have influenced the bakery. It could be an inspiring story for many." Mr. Albert knew that Madison was trying to get more information from him, and although he appreciated her interest, he also understood that some things had to remain secret, at least for now. "Madison, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but there are parts of our story that are better left in the past. The bakery is a special place, and we prefer to keep its magic just as it is." Madison nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She decided to change her approach. "And Valerie, I've seen her spending a lot of time here. She's a charming girl, but she seems to have a complicated story. What's her relationship with Mrs. Elizabeth?" The question about Valerie made Mr. Albert tense. He knew he couldn't reveal the truth about the girl without her consent, and even less to a journalist who could spread the story to a wider audience. "Valerie is a special girl to all of us," he finally said. "She's part of our little family here, and we care about her a lot." Madison noticed the evasiveness in Mr. Albert's response, which only increased her curiosity. She decided not to press him further for the moment, but she knew there was something bigger at play. With a smile, she put away her notebook and thanked Mr. Albert for his time. "Thank you for talking with me, Mr. Albert. I'll keep investigating, and I hope that eventually we can share more of the bakery's story with the world." Mr. Albert nodded, watching as Madison left the bakery. As the door closed behind her, he couldn't help but feel a growing unease. Madison was persistent, and although he had managed to keep some things secret, he knew it wouldn't be easy to keep her away forever. He had to be more cautious, especially with the truth about Valerie. Meanwhile, outside the bakery, Madison continued her investigation. She delved into old archives, interviewed more people in town, and collected stories that gave her a clearer picture of the connection between Mrs. Elizabeth, the bakery, and Mr. Albert's family. The more she discovered, the more convinced she became that there was a deep secret buried in the family's past, a secret that, if uncovered, could change everything. However, Madison wasn't the only one who began asking questions. Mark, who hadn't given up on his intention to sell the bakery, learned of Madison's investigation and saw it as an opportunity to pressure his brother. If he could discredit the bakery or reveal some family scandal, he might be able to force Mr. Albert to sell. He decided to approach Madison, offering his help to uncover the truth. One night, while Madison was reviewing her notes at the small town inn, Mark surprised her with an unexpected visit. "Good evening, Madison," he greeted, with his characteristic cold smile. "I've heard you're investigating my family's history. Perhaps I can help you find what you're looking for." Madison looked at him with a mix of surprise and caution. She knew Mark had his own motives, but she also knew he could offer valuable information. "I'm interested in any information you can share, Mark. Why don't you sit down and we can talk?" Mark accepted the invitation, and over the next hour he provided Madison with details she hadn't known about the family's history, hinting at tensions and conflicts that had existed long before she arrived in town. However, Madison noticed that Mark was more interested in damaging his brother's reputation than in helping her discover the truth. When Mark finally left, Madison was left alone in the inn, reflecting on what she had learned. She knew she was close to discovering something big, something that could change the course of the bakery's history and the family that ran it. But she also realized that she was playing with fire. Mr. Albert and Mark had opposing agendas, and she found herself in the middle of their conflict. Meanwhile, at the bakery, Mr. Albert was preparing for what he knew would be an inevitable confrontation with his brother, and perhaps with the past he had tried to bury for so long. He knew the truth about Valerie was close to coming out, and when it did, everything would change. Night fell over the town, bringing with it the certainty that the forbidden knowledge Madison sought could unleash a storm no one could control. As the days passed, the activity inside the bakery didn't stop. Each day, Mrs. Elizabeth and Manuel worked together, perfecting the dream bread recipe that had begun to attract more and more customers. The bakery was thriving, but Mr. Albert couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was approaching, one that had nothing to do with the weather, but with the forces that were beginning to move in the shadows. Meanwhile, at the bakery, Mr. Albert didn't suspect that Mark's attack was closer than he imagined. He focused on the business, his growing relationship with Valerie, and protecting his family's legacy. However, one morning, the first sign of trouble appeared when a health inspector arrived at the bakery's door, accompanied by Mark. "Good morning, Mr. Albert," the inspector greeted, showing his official badge. "We are here to conduct a routine inspection." Mr. Albert, surprised, looked at Mark, who maintained a satisfied smile on his face. "An inspection? We didn't have any scheduled." "It's a surprise inspection," the inspector responded in a formal tone. "We want to ensure everything is in order at your establishment." Though Mr. Albert knew the bakery had always complied with regulations, he couldn't help but feel a pang of worry. He called Manuel and Mrs. Elizabeth to join him during the inspection. For the next hour, the inspector scrutinized every corner of the bakery with a thoroughness that made it clear He was looking for any small detail he could use against them. Finally, after an exhaustive inspection, the inspector found some minor irregularities. Nothing serious, but enough to justify a temporary closure of the business until they were resolved. Mr. Albert felt his blood run cold. He knew those irregularities were minor and could be quickly fixed, but the damage was already done. A temporary closure meant economic losses, but more importantly, it planted doubts among customers and the community. Mark, seeing the opportunity to apply more pressure, wasted no time confronting his brother. "I warned you, Albert. This business is no longer viable. You should consider my offer before things get worse." Mr. Albert felt a wave of anger, but also a sense of helplessness. He knew Mark had manipulated the situation to force him to give in, but he wasn't willing to surrender so easily. "I am not going to sell the bakery, Mark," he said firmly. "This place is more than just a business. It's the heart of this community, and I won't allow you to destroy it." Mark scowled, irritated by his brother's stubbornness. "Then you're doomed to lose everything," he retorted before leaving Mr. Albert with the weight of the situation on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Madison, who had been observing from a distance, felt growing discomfort with her alliance with Mark. She knew that what she was doing had implications far beyond a simple story, but she was too involved to back out now. With the bakery temporarily closed, Mr. Albert was forced to face the reality of the situation. The closure not only impacted his finances, but also affected the people who depended on the bakery: Manuel, Mrs. Elizabeth, and especially Valerie. The community, puzzled by the news, began to murmur, wondering if the business could survive this blow. Valerie, though shielded from most of the details, sensed the tension in the air. She felt that something bad was happening, and though she didn't fully understand what it was, she knew it had to do with the bakery and the relationship between Mr. Albert and Mark. One afternoon, while Mr. Albert sat alone in his office, reviewing the business papers with a mixture of worry and desperation, Valerie quietly entered. She approached him and, without saying a word, hugged him. The gesture, simple but full of meaning, touched something deep inside Mr. Albert. He felt that despite everything, he had to keep fighting, not just for the bakery, but for Valerie, for the future he wanted to build for her. Madison, who had been investigating more about the family's history, began to feel she was on the verge of discovering something crucial. She knew there was a connection between Mrs. Elizabeth, the bread recipe, and the story of Mr. Albert's family that had yet to come to light. She decided it was time to confront Mr. Albert directly, even though she knew doing so could set off a chain of unpredictable events. That night, Madison went to the bakery, finding Mr. Albert alone, cleaning the place as he tried to keep his mind occupied. "Albert," she said softly, entering quietly, "I need to talk to you." Mr. Albert looked at her, knowing that the conversation they were about to have could change everything. "Go ahead, Madison. What do you want to know?" Madison took a deep breath before continuing. "I've discovered many things about your family, the bakery, and what Mark is trying to do, but I also know there's something more, something that hasn't been said. What are you hiding, Albert?" Mr. Albert felt a mix of fear and relief at the same time. He knew the truth had to come out eventually, but he also feared the consequences. "There are things I'd rather keep private, Madison, not for my sake, but for the people I love and who depend on me." Madison looked at him with empathy, understanding the dilemma he was in. "I don't want to hurt you, Albert. I just want to understand the whole story. Maybe if people knew the truth, they would be on your side." Mr. Albert sighed, knowing he was at a point of no return. "There are truths that can't be revealed without consequences, Madison, but maybe it's time you knew part of it." The conversation that followed was long and painful. Mr. Albert revealed to Madison what Mrs. Elizabeth had confessed to him, the true identity of Valerie and the bond that tied him to her. Madison, though moved by the story, immediately understood the implications. She knew that if she published that information, it would not only unleash a scandal, but also potentially destroy what Mr. Albert had been trying to protect. At the end of the conversation, Madison remained silent, processing everything she had heard. She knew she had a difficult decision to make: reveal the truth to the world and risk harming the people she now considered her friends, or keep the secret and betray her journalistic instinct. As the night wore on and the cold intensified, Mr. Albert felt a strange mix of relief and worry. He had shared his truth, but it was now up to Madison to decide what to do with it. He knew that regardless of the decision she made, the conflict with Mark was far from over, and the coming weeks would be crucial for the future of the bakery, Valerie, and everyone who depended on it. The temporary closure of the bakery had left a deep mark on the community. What had once been a place of gathering and warmth was now empty and cold, its doors closed as a symbol of the conflict that had erupted between the brothers. The townspeople, used to starting their days with the smell of freshly baked bread, felt disoriented and worried. Rumors began to circulate, and the trust in the family business that had been a pillar of the community began to waver. Mr. Albert felt the weight of each day with the bakery closed. He knew time was not on his side. Every day that passed, the possibility of regaining the community's trust became more difficult. Moreover, Mark's pressure did not let up. His brother continued to insist that the only viable option was to sell the bakery and allow the consortium to proceed with the construction of the shopping center. But Albert refused to give up. He had come too far to abandon now. Madison, for her part, found herself in a moral dilemma. After hearing the truth about Valerie, she understood the enormous impact that publishing that information would have. Though her journalistic instinct pushed her to reveal everything, her conscience told her she had to protect the people involved, especially Valerie, an innocent child in the middle of a battle she had not asked for. Meanwhile, the community began to divide. Some supported Mr. Albert, recognizing his effort to keep the tradition and family legacy alive. These were mostly the older customers, those who remembered the days when the bakery had been run by Albert's parents and who valued the history and sense of community the bakery represented. On the other hand, there were those who saw in Mark's offer an opportunity for progress. The town had been struggling economically for years, and the construction of a shopping center promised jobs, growth, and modernization. These neighbors saw Mr. Albert as a man trapped in the past, unable to adapt to the needs of the present. Madison, determined to help Mr. Albert in some way, began working on an article that could change the narrative. Instead of focusing on the most scandalous aspects of the story, she decided to highlight the importance of the bakery to the community. The legacy of Mrs. Elizabeth and Mr. Albert's effort to keep traditions alive in a rapidly changing world. With the support of some of the town's most influential residents, Madison began interviewing customers and former bakery employees, collecting personal stories that reflected the positive impact the business had had on their lives. Her goal was to show that the bakery was not just a business, but the beating heart of the community, a place that had witnessed generations of stories, of encounters, of joys, and of sorrows. Meanwhile, Mark did not sit idly by. Taking advantage of the division in the community, he began organizing meetings with the townspeople, promising prosperity and a better future if they accepted the construction of the shopping center. His rhetoric was convincing, and more people began to consider his offer. Even those who had been loyal to the bakery began to doubt, fearing that the family business could not survive the onslaught of modern times. The situation reached a critical point when a group of neighbors decided to organize a vote to determine the bakery's future. The idea was simple. Those who supported Mr. Albert would vote to keep the bakery running, while those who supported Mark would vote to sell the land to the consortium. The vote would not be legally binding, but the outcome would have a significant impact on public perception and could influence Mr. Albert's final decision. The news of the vote spread quickly, and on the chosen day, the entire town gathered in the central plaza. Mr. Albert watched from a distance, feeling the tension grow inside him. He knew that his future and Valerie's were at stake, but he also knew he couldn't force the community to support him. All he could do was wait and trust that the love for the bakery, for what it represented, would be enough to tip the balance in his favor. Madison, determined not to stay on the sidelines, published her article on the same day as the vote. The text, titled "The Soul of the Town, the Story of the Bakery That United Generations," was distributed throughout the town. In it, Madison narrated not only the story of the bakery, but also the stories of the people who had been touched by its existence. The article spoke of Mrs. Elizabeth's sacrifice, Mr. Albert's tireless effort to keep his family's heritage alive, and the impact the bakery had had on so many lives. The article had an immediate effect. The townspeople, who had been divided, began to reconsider their positions. The vote, which initially seemed tilted in Mark's favor, began to even out. The personal stories told in the article resonated in the hearts of many, reminding them that the bakery was not just a building, but a symbol of everything the community had been and could be again. On the day of the vote, the plaza was filled with tension and expectation. The neighbors voted in silence, aware of the importance of the decision they were making. When the votes were finally counted, the difference was minimal, but enough for Mr. Albert to know that he still had the support of the majority. Mark, upon seeing the result, couldn't hide his frustration. He knew he had lost an important battle, but he wasn't ready to give up. With a dismissive gesture, he walked away from the square, while Mr. Albert, surrounded by those who supported him, felt a renewed determination to continue the fight. However, he knew the battle wasn't over. The temporary closure of the bakery was still a reality, and Mark still had resources and allies to turn to. But in that moment, Mr. Albert felt he wasn't alone. He had Valerie, Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and now a community that, though divided, had remembered what truly mattered. Madison, for her part, watched the scene with a mix of relief and concern. She knew she had made the right decision by writing her article, but she was also aware that she had crossed a line. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while she felt she had contributed to something bigger than herself. As night fell over the town, Mr. Albert returned to the bakery. Though the temporary closure was still in effect, there was a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also knew he wasn't willing to give in. With the community by his side and the truth in his heart, he was ready to face whatever came his way. Outside, the cold night wrapped the small town like a blanket, as Mr. Albert remained in his office, his mind caught in a whirlwind of thoughts. Madison's article had managed to turn the situation around, but it wasn't enough. He knew the fight was far from over. As he reviewed the bakery's documents, Valerie's image came to mind. His heart tightened at the thought of the little girl who, unknowingly, had become the center of his world. The time had come to tell her the truth. Valerie had the right to know who she really was, to understand her story and the bond that united them. Mr. Albert knew it would be a difficult conversation, but he also knew he could no longer delay it. That night, after closing the bakery, Mr. Albert made his way to the small room where Valerie slept. The girl, exhausted from the intensity of the past few days, was deeply asleep, her face peaceful under the blankets. Mr. Albert sat on the edge of the bed, watching her with tenderness. He knew that as soon as she woke up, her life would change forever. Finally, he gathered his courage and gently woke her. Valerie opened her eyes, a little disoriented, but smiled when she saw Mr. Albert beside her. "What's wrong, Uncle Albert?" she asked, using the affectionate term she had adopted for him. Mr. Albert felt a lump in his throat when he heard her call him that, but he knew he had to go on. "Valerie, there's something very important I need to tell you, something I've been keeping, but now it's time for you to know." Valerie looked at him curiously, sitting up in bed and rubbing her eyes. "What is it, Uncle?" Mr. Albert took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about her mother, the woman he had deeply loved in his youth, and how circumstances had separated them. He explained how Mrs. Elizabeth had found her mother and helped her during her last days, and how after her mother's death, Elizabeth had cared for her as if she were her own granddaughter. Valerie listened in silence, her big eyes fixed on Mr. Albert as she processed the story. When he finally reached the most important point, Mr. Albert took Valerie's small hands in his and looked her directly in the eyes. "Valerie," he said softly but firmly, "you are more than a child we care for. You are my daughter. You are the daughter of the woman I loved more than anything in this world." Valerie blinked, confused. "Your daughter? My mum was the woman you loved?" Mr. Albert nodded, feeling a tear slide down his cheek. "Yes, Valerie. Your mother and I were meant to be together, but life separated us. I never knew you existed, never knew I had a daughter to love until Mrs. Elizabeth told me the truth. And now that I know, all I want is to protect you and love you as your father would have wanted." Valerie remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The revelation was huge, and the girl, though mature for her age, struggled to understand everything it entailed. Finally, her eyes filled with tears, and she threw herself into Mr. Albert's arms, holding on to him tightly. "I didn't know, she whispered through sobs. "I always felt so alone, but you're my family." Mr. Albert hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of years of pain and separation lift in that instant. "You'll never be alone, Valerie. I'll be here for you, always. You are my family, and together we'll face whatever comes." The two stayed like that for a long time, embracing, sharing a moment of deep connection neither had experienced before. For Valerie, the revelation of her true identity was a shock, but it also gave her a sense of belonging she had never known. For Mr. Albert, it was a moment of redemption, the chance to make amends for a past full of loss and regrets. The next morning, the bakery remained closed, but inside a new energy was beginning to take shape. Valerie, still processing the information, felt more confident in herself and closer to Mr. Albert than ever. The two worked together in the bakery, helping Mrs. Elizabeth and Manuel prepare for what they knew would be a tough reopening process. Madison, who had decided not to publish the truth about Valerie, came to the bakery that afternoon to talk to Mr. Albert. Though she hadn't published the full story, her previous article had helped restore some of the community's trust, and she was determined to do more. "Albert," Madison began, "I've been thinking about what you told me. I didn't publish that part of the story because I believe it's something personal that should be handled carefully. But I want to help. I want people to see what's really at stake here." Mr. Albert looked at her with gratitude. He knew Madison had had the opportunity to destroy him with the truth, but she had chosen to protect him. "Thank you, Madison. You don't know how much this means to me and Valerie." Madison nodded. "I think the best way forward is to keep showing the truth, but from a positive perspective. I want to write a series of articles about how small businesses like yours not only survive, but thrive when they have the support of their community. If we can show that, I think people will start to see things differently." Mr. Albert accepted Madison's offer. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, but he also knew he was no longer alone in this fight. He had Valerie, Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and now Madison by his side. Together, they had a real chance to save the bakery and keep his family's legacy alive. That night, as snow continued to fall gently over the town, Mr. Albert sat with Valerie in the small dining room of the bakery. They shared a simple dinner, but the atmosphere was filled with a new hope. Valerie, still absorbing everything she had learned, felt a mix of emotions, but also a deep gratitude for finally having a family to love. "I promise I won't let anything bad happen to you, Valerie," Mr. Albert said, breaking the silence. "I'll do everything in my power to protect you and give you a life full of love and happiness." Valerie looked at him, her eyes filled with newfound confidence. "I know, Dad, and I'll help you protect the bakery, because this is our home, and I won't let anyone take it from us." Mr. Albert smiled, proud of Valerie's strength. He knew they had a long road ahead, but he also knew that with her by his side, they could overcome any obstacle. As the wind blew outside, Mr. Albert and Valerie prepared for whatever might come, knowing that no matter what, they would face it together, as the family they were always meant to be. Winter's cold still lingered in the small town, but inside the bakery, something had changed. The revelation of Valerie's true identity and Mr. Albert's renewed determination had created an atmosphere of hope and resilience that filled every corner of the place. However, the reality of the temporary closure was still a dark cloud over them. Despite their efforts to keep the business afloat, time was running out, and Mark's pressure was only increasing. The following days were a mix of hard work and planning. Mr. Albert, with Madison's help, began to devise a strategy to reopen the bakery and regain the community's trust. They knew it would be a tough journey, but they were determined not to give up. Meanwhile, Mark continued his campaign to discredit the bakery and convince the town's residents that selling the land was the best option. One morning, as Mr. Albert reviewed documents and made calls to speed up the reopening process, he received an official letter from the consortium Mark represented. The letter offered a final chance. If Mr. Albert agreed to sell the bakery within 2 weeks, he would receive substantial compensation that would allow him to start a new life elsewhere. The offer was tempting, and the pressure from Mark, who had made contacts in high places to close the deal, was growing more intense. Mr. Albert sat in his office, the letter in hand, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. He knew that accepting would mean giving up his family's legacy, but he also knew time was running out. Funds were limited, and reopening the bakery didn't guarantee immediate success. The consortium's offer was a quick solution, but one that meant abandoning everything he had fought to protect. As Mr. Albert pondered the offer, Valerie entered the office, noticing the somber expression on his face. "What's wrong, Dad? Why do you look so sad?" Mr. Albert looked up at her, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew he couldn't hide the truth from her. "I've received an offer to sell the bakery, Valerie. An offer that could solve our financial problems, but it would mean leaving all this behind." Valerie looked at him, processing what he was saying. "Sell the bakery? Leave all this? But this is our home." Mr. Albert nodded slowly. "I know, Valerie, but it's also true that we're in a tough situation. If we don't manage to reopen the bakery soon, we could lose everything anyway. I'm trying to find the best solution for us, but it's not easy." Valerie stepped closer to him and took his hand, with a determination in her eyes that reflected the strength she had inherited from her mother. "We can't give up, Dad. We can't let Mark take what belongs to us. This bakery is ours and we can't sell it. We can't let our family's story end like this." Valerie's words resonated in Mr. Albert's heart. He knew the girl was right. They had come too far to give up now. Mark's offer was tempting, but the price to pay was too high. They wouldn't just lose the bakery, they would lose the opportunity to preserve their family's legacy and the community they had built around it. With a newfound determination, Mr. Albert decided to reject the consortium's offer. He knew it would be an uphill battle, but he also knew he had something Mark could never buy: the love and unity of his family and the support of the community. That same afternoon, Mr. Albert gathered with Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and Madison to share his decision. Though they knew the road ahead would be tough, everyone agreed it was the best choice. With a plan in place to reopen the bakery, they began working tirelessly to resolve the issues highlighted in the inspection and prepare everything for the big day. Madison, determined to help in every way possible, used her media contacts to generate support for the bakery. She published a series of articles on the value of small family businesses and the importance of preserving traditions in a rapidly changing world. Her work drew the attention of journalists and citizens from outside the town, who began to show interest in the bakery's story and what it represented. Meanwhile, Mark, upon learning that his brother had rejected the offer, intensified his efforts to pressure Mr. Albert. He called a meeting with the consortium leaders and began looking for ways to undermine his brother's attempts to reopen the bakery. He knew that if he could delay the reopening long enough, he might force Albert to reconsider his decision. The day of the reopening finally arrived. Despite the difficulties, Mr. Albert, with the help of Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, Valerie, and Madison, had managed to prepare the bakery to welcome customers once again. The community, which had once been divided, began to gather in front of the bakery, drawn by the scent of freshly baked bread and the hope of seeing the return of a business that had been part of their lives for generations. Mr. Albert, his heart pounding, opened the bakery's doors. The first customers entered timidly, but soon the place was filled with life, with animated conversations and the familiar sound of laughter and greetings. Pan de los Sueños, Mrs. Elizabeth's special recipe, was an immediate hit, and soon the bakery was crowded with people, some of whom had traveled from neighboring towns to try the famous bread and support the family. Madison, who had been covering the event for her final article, watched with satisfaction as the bakery thrived once more. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she also knew they had taken a big step toward recovery. Mark, seeing the success of the reopening, couldn't hide his frustration. Despite all his efforts, his brother had managed to reopen the bakery and regain the community's support. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. He knew he still had an ace up his sleeve, something he could use to destabilize his brother and finally achieve his goal. Meanwhile, Mr. Albert, though aware that the battle with Mark wasn't over, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had accomplished what many thought impossible: reopening the bakery and regaining the community's trust. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but with Valerie, Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and Madison by his side, he felt they could face anything. That night, after closing the bakery, Mr. Albert sat with Valerie in the small dining room, sharing a simple but meaningful meal. "We did it, Valerie," he said with a smile. "We reopened the bakery. This is just the beginning, but we've already proven we can overcome any obstacle." Valerie nodded, a smile on her face. "Yes, Dad, we did it together. And I know that, no matter what happens, we'll always be here to protect our home." Mr. Albert looked at her with pride, knowing Valerie was right. The battle wasn't over yet, but with the love and unity they shared, he was sure they could face whatever came their way. The next morning, the sun timidly rose over the small town, melting the last layers of snow and filling the air with a fresh breeze full of promises. Inside the bakery, the activity was frantic. Today was the long-awaited day, the official reopening. Mr. Albert, along with Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and Valerie, worked with renewed determination, making sure everything was perfect to welcome the customers who had patiently waited for the return of the pan de los sueños. The bakery had been through a lot in the past few months, and every team member felt the weight of this day's importance. The community, once divided, now stood united in their support for the business that had been the heart of the town for generations. Early on, the square in front of the bakery began to fill with people. Some were regular neighbors, others came from nearby towns, drawn by the bakery's story and its revival. The anticipation was in the air, and the line outside the door grew longer and longer. Mr. Albert, though nervous, felt a deep gratitude towards all who had gathered. He knew the reopening was not only a crucial moment for the business, but also a testament that tradition and perseverance could prevail in the face of any adversity. Before opening the doors, Mr. Albert gathered with Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, and Valerie in the small dining room of the bakery. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, ready for the big day. The tension was palpable, but so was the hope. "Today is an important day," Mr. Albert said, looking at each of them. "We've worked hard to get here, and I know we'll succeed. But no matter what happens, I want you to remember that what we've done is more than just reopening a bakery. We've shown that when we stay united, we can overcome anything." Mrs. Elizabeth, her hand still strong despite the years, nodded with a serene smile. "This place has seen many things, Albert, but what we're doing today is a rebirth. We're bringing back not just a business, but the soul of this community." Manuel, who had been a pillar of support throughout the process, simply nodded, his expression calm but determined. "We're ready," he said firmly. "This is our moment." Valerie, who had stood by Mr. Albert through all the ups and downs, couldn't help but feel excited. She knew this was a crucial day, not just for the bakery, but also for her family. "Let's do this," she said, her voice filled with the innocence and determination of youth. "We won't let anything stop us." With those words, Mr. Albert decided to open the doors. As the bakery door slid smoothly open, the bustle of people outside filled the space. The first customers entered, their faces lit up with the joy of returning to the place they had missed so much. The bread of dreams was displayed in the showcases, freshly baked, its aroma filling the air with a mix of nostalgia and promise. Each loaf was a reminder of everything the bakery stood for: hard work, dedication, and a deep connection to the past and present of the community. Customers began placing their orders, some with tears in their eyes as they remembered simpler times, others with smiles of relief at seeing the bakery back in business. Mrs. Elizabeth and Manuel's hands worked skillfully, serving each order with the same passion they had from the start. Valerie moved gracefully among the customers, helping wherever she could, her face radiant with happiness. She knew they were doing something important, something that transcended the simple act of baking and selling bread. Madison, who had been documenting the entire process, captured every moment with her camera and notes. She knew what she was witnessing was more than just the reopening of a business. It was the rebirth of a community, the triumph of collective effort over adversity. As the day progressed, the bakery filled with laughter, lively conversations, and the sound of cash registers. It was as if the place had regained its former glory. but with a new energy born from struggle and perseverance. The success of the reopening was evident. The line of customers never diminished, and the news of the bakery's return spread quickly, attracting even those who had doubted the business's success. Mr. Albert, watching the scene from behind the counter, felt the weight of the past months fade away, replaced by deep and genuine satisfaction. As evening fell and the last customer had been served, with the bakery lights beginning to dim, Mr. Albert allowed himself a moment to reflect. The reopening had been an overwhelming success, but more than that, it had been a reminder of what they could achieve when they stayed true to their principles and their community. As he closed the door for the last time that day, Mr. Albert turned to Valerie, who had been with him throughout the day. "We did it, Valerie," he said with a tired but proud smile. "We did it together." Valerie smiled and hugged him, feeling they had overcome something monumental. "Yes, Dad, and we'll keep moving forward, no matter what." With the support of his family and community, Mr. Albert knew that while there were still challenges ahead, they were better prepared than ever to face them. The reopening had not only revived the bakery, but had also strengthened the bonds that united them, creating a solid foundation for whatever the future might hold. Winter had finally given way to spring, and with it the small town blossomed into a vibrant revival. The days grew longer, the streets filled with color, and Mr. Albert's bakery became the center of community life, stronger and more alive than ever. Since the successful reopening, the bakery had thrived in ways Mr. Albert had never imagined. Every day, customers filled the place, eager to enjoy the bread of dreams and share a moment in the warm and welcoming atmosphere that Mrs. Elizabeth, Manuel, Valerie, and Mr. Albert had so carefully crafted. The bakery had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the ability of a community to come together in difficult times. Mark, seeing that all his attempts to destroy the bakery had failed, finally accepted reality. He had lost the battle, and in the process, realized he had been fighting for something he had never fully understood, the deep connection between people and the places they loved. Over time, Mark decided to leave the town, seeking redemption, and to find himself elsewhere. His departure was quiet, without fuss, and although Mr. Albert knew the relationship with his brother was far from mended, he felt peace knowing the conflict had ended. With Mark out of the picture, Mr. Albert focused entirely on the bakery and his family. The days passed with a routine that, far from being monotonous, brought with it the satisfaction of having overcome the hardest obstacles. Each loaf of bread that came out of the oven, every smile from a satisfied customer, was a reminder of all they had achieved. Valerie, now fully integrated into the life of the bakery, continued learning the art of bread making, but she was also discovering her own passion for cooking and pastry. Under the guidance of Mrs. Elizabeth and Manuel, she began experimenting with new recipes, bringing her personal touch to the family tradition. The little girl who had arrived at the bakery hungry and alone was now a confident young woman with a bright future ahead. One day, while Mr. Albert and Valerie were working together on a new recipe, she paused and looked at him with a smile. "Dad, I think we should try something new, something that combines the best of what we do here, but with a modern twist." Mr. Albert watched her with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" Valerie leaned over the table, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "A line of breads and sweets that represent not only our history, but also the future. I want to create something that combines tradition with innovation, something people not only enjoy but also find inspiring." Mr. Albert smiled, proud of Valerie's entrepreneurial spirit. "That's a great idea, Valerie. I always knew you had talent, but now I see you also have the vision to take this bakery beyond what I ever imagined." Valerie blushed, but she couldn't hide her excitement. She knew that with Mr. Albert's support and the experience of Mrs. Elizabeth and Manuel, they could create something truly special. Together, they began planning the new product line, experimenting with flavors and techniques, blending the old with the new. As they worked on this new phase, the bakery continued to thrive. Madison, who had been with them from the beginning, documented every step, ensuring the bakery's story reached beyond the borders of the small town. Her articles attracted the attention of larger media outlets, and soon the bakery became a destination for those seeking something authentic, an experience that combined history, community, and good taste. On the day of the new product line's launch, the bakery was packed. The community gathered to celebrate not only the bakery's success, but also the future that Valerie and Mr. Albert were building together. The new line was an immediate success, and soon orders began pouring in from all over the country. Mr. Albert, watching Valerie as she served customers and shared her enthusiasm for the new products, felt a deep satisfaction. He knew the time had come to step back, to trust the new generation, to carry forward the legacy he had built with such effort. That night, after closing the bakery, Mr. Albert, Valerie, Mrs. Elizabeth, and Manuel gathered in the dining room to share a quiet dinner. The atmosphere was filled with a peace and joy that could only come from knowing they had overcome all the adversities and that the future was full of promise. "Dad," said Valerie as they ate, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. Not just for giving me a home, but for teaching me what it means to fight for what you love. I promise I will carry on everything we've built here." Mr. Albert smiled, his eyes shining with tears of pride. "The gratitude is mutual, Valerie. You've taught me not to give up, to see the value in every little moment, and to remember that the most important thing in life is family and community. I'm sure you will take this bakery to places I can't even imagine." Mrs. Elizabeth, who had witnessed so many transformations throughout her life, nodded with a serene smile. "This place is more than a bakery. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together, and I know that in Valerie's hands it will continue to be a beacon of hope and tradition." Manuel, always the man of few words, raised his glass in a silent toast, his gesture full of respect and camaraderie. Over time, Mr. Albert's bakery became a legend in the culinary world, an example of how tradition and innovation could coexist and flourish together. Valerie took the business to new heights, but she always kept the essence of what the bakery represented intact. A place where love, hard work, and community were woven into every loaf of bread. The small town, which had been the setting for so many trials and triumphs, continued to thrive, united by the bonds that had been strengthened throughout the bakery's history. And though time passed and generations changed, the bread of dreams remained a symbol of all the good that could arise when heart, tradition, and perseverance were combined. Thus, the bakery not only survived but flourished, becoming a legacy that transcended time and borders, a testament that when you fight for what you love, success is not just a possibility, but a certainty. In life, challenges and adversities are inevitable, but when we face those trials with love, perseverance, and the support of those around us, we can not only overcome them, but also transform them into opportunities to grow and flourish. True success is not only measured by what we achieve, but by the legacy of hope, unity, and hard work that we leave in the hearts of our community. Just as a loaf of bread is kneaded with patience and dedication, our lives are built with every act of kindness and every brave decision. And in the end, what truly matters is not just reaching the goal, but the shared journey and the hands that accompanied us along the way. And that's all for today. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new content. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next video. Take care.